Thanks very much for inviting me here. And also thanks very much, Rukia, for the organization. It's been truly flawless, as far as I can tell at least. So thanks for that also. I'm very glad to be able to present our work, Learning Inequality during the COVID-19 pandemic here, which is joint work together with Per Engzel and Arun Frey. I'm also asked to introduce myself very briefly. I'm a DPhil student in the sociology department in Oxford. My own research is mostly methods focused. I have a background in econometrics and statistics, so this is a bit of a detour for me. Some of you might know Per Engzel as more of an educational scholar. So he's done more on inequality in education, etc. It's also been the division of labor. So Arun and myself have been mostly dealing with the data, the modeling, etc. Whereas Per Engzel has done most of the grounding of our findings in theory. So I will be able to answer most of the methodological questions and hopefully most of the educational ones, but I might have to relay your questions to Per, which I will do, of course. All right, so without further ado, I think the motivation for this study, we didn't talk about it too much because it's the same motivation as the entire conference, basically, with COVID-19 pandemic induced shutdowns basically being one of the largest disruptions to education in history, with most, if not all, students affected in some way or other by shutdowns, by limited resources, etc. The problem, of course, that we all know is also that education, the impact on education is much less easy to measure than certain other types of real-time indicators like economic indicators, the pandemic indicators, where there are deaths, etc. And thus, people have struggled to actually measure or weigh the effect of, for example, a measure like a school shutdown vis-a-vis, for example, its impact on educational progress of pupils. So luckily, we've been able to write this paper a couple months ago to actually find some sort of indication of what the effect has been of a fairly mild shutdown by all means, and hopefully at least enable a bit more discussion and thought about whether it's worth it. And well, hopefully, well, fortunately, we don't have to make the decision ourselves, but at least we could provide some input to it. So at the time of writing, there were a couple of other studies which had been published, which looked at some types of indications of educational performance. They were mostly using weird data from time to time. So for example, Chetty and colleagues had a paper coming out measuring all kinds of indicators which showed pandemic effects, the effects of pandemics. In this case, this is a learning platform called Zern, and it basically shows how Zern is an online platform. You can make tasks during your educational process. And you can see how, for example, there's been some inequality in the way in which the platform has been used, for example, between top income quartiles and middle income quartiles. Some other work from the UK has looked at test score inequality, basically comparing end of year tests in the pandemic year with previous years. And for example, other work by Maldonado and De Witte does a similar study setup where they look at test scores in the pandemic year vis-a-vis a cohort in the previous year. So one of the major problems with most work is either that there's a lot of sample selection. So for example, with these types of the Chetty paper where they use this opt-in type of online platform, there's a lot of selectivity obviously going on. And a different problem, which is perhaps more severe, are these studies where they compare different cohorts and their performance of one another. Because as we know, and when we look at PISA scores, for example, there is a lot of there's a lot of strong trend going on in most countries. So every cohort, subsequent cohort, performance is different, and especially sort of trying to tease out what the effect of a pandemic has been in a single year really needs a fairly robust setup where we can actually look within pupils, perhaps, or within schools, etc. This is exactly what our study is able to offer, which is up to some degree a feature of the Dutch system. So we're quite robust and quite rigorous in the way we capture testing of pupils, and it's also partly due to sheer luck. We've been extremely lucky that pupils in the Netherlands are tested twice a year, and the shutdown was exactly in between these two testing moments. So without this, we would have had much more trouble estimating the effects that we do. So it's a bit, yeah, it's when you think of it, you couldn't have thought of a better research design for us, or a better moment when the schools were shut down. So what is this data? It's individual level data of pupils' test scores standardized towards the population in the Netherlands amongst a couple of didactic areas. The ones that we're interested in this case are mathematics, reading comprehension, and spelling. And these tests are taken twice a year, and they're actually explicitly designed to test overall progress of a pupil. The first test takes place in around February, March. So actually this year's test will be coming in shortly, and at the end of the year as well. Which basically makes our design very, very straightforward. So as you can see here, this is the testing frequency of pupils. This is the school lockdown period, and these are the 4 years of interest. We look at a couple of cohorts to allow for time trends as well. And what you basically see is that this is the first testing peak around February and January, which is right now, but the question is if they're going to be delayed and by how much. These are all the normal years, and then basically in a normal year you would have a second peak in the summer. One thing to note immediately, and you will all obviously already have noted, there has been less frequency of testing at the end of the last year. So there's a serious attrition going on or loss to follow-up. So some pupils did do a test in the middle of the year, but they have not done any at the end of the year. So this is one of the main challenges to identification that we had. I'll talk about it in depth later, but so that's quite a big problem. So a lot of people did not do any follow-up tests. Other than the attrition, our design is actually so simple. It's you can capture it in a single equation. What we do is we basically look at how did difference between a pupil's score in the middle of the year and the end of the year. Simple as that. In terms of percentile scores. So if you would have been performing at the 50th percentile in the middle, and at the end of the year on the same subject, you would perform at 48, for example, you would have lost 2. If you did 52, you would have gained 2. That's our difference outcome. And basically we compare this difference for the treatment year, where the COVID shutdown occurred, with all previous years. And that's it. We don't do much else than that. We slice and dice the data set along a couple of different variables to allow for evaluation of different groups. So was the effect perhaps bigger for girls or boys? Was it bigger for math or for reading? But other than that, it's almost unbelievable how simple the equation in the end was. It's also funny to mention, and perhaps also interesting to hear your thoughts on it, but we pre-registered most of our analyses before we performed them and before we got the data. And we had a lot of hypotheses about differences between, for example, older pupils and younger pupils, or boys and girls, different types of tests. But we found extremely little evidence and a lot of robustness actually of our effect, which surprised us in a way. But well, maybe it's not to be surprised about. So what does it look like, this outcome variable? So what are we actually studying? What you see here is basically how in normal years, this outcome variable that we're interested in, the difference, the development of a pupil between the middle of a year and end of the year looks like. So it's strongly centered around 0. I was also extremely surprised by the width. So there are quite some pupils who actually drop 50 percentile points or they gain 50 percentile points. But apparently it's been told to me that this is common in educational research. And what we're actually interested in is this red density plot. And as you can see, it moves to the left a bit. So where normally speaking, you have a very nice centered distribution around 0. So people stay at the same position that they used to be in. We see a marked sort of shift to the left in our interest year. So this is exactly what we're estimating. So what is the actual mean effect of the treatment year relative to previous years? So we estimated this effect for multiple groups. And we find quite sizable learning loss. So basically looking at a composite score of all the tests that they've done. So sort of meaning the mathematics score, the reading score, and the spelling score. For simplicity's sake in this case, we find that pupils in the pandemic affected year lose about 3 percentile points relative to any other year. So where normally speaking, you would find about actually a slight improvement for most control years, you find a marked drop in the pandemic year. So pupils who used to be performing at the 50th percentile, for example, are now performing around 47. What is also striking about the graph, and we found extremely surprising in a way, is the consistency of this effect across different groups. For example, boys and girls, it's very consistent. Prior performance has very little effect on how much or the improvement. Math, spelling, reading is the same. And grade, so the age of the pupil. So for your view, grade 7 is about age 10, 11, and every year, one year younger. We find very little difference there as well. The only extremely strong effect that we find, which is also perhaps worrying, and it's also the reason why the title is the way it is the fact that parental education, which is an indicator for potential for learning deficit, was one of the strongest, well, it's the only variable that we could find, we had in the data, which actually shows a marked difference between groups. So just to give an indication, a low or lowest parental education, these two groups are about 5% of the total population. So they are actually the quite small low group. And this measure is used by the CBS, the Central Statistics in the Netherlands, to actually send funding to schools to help them deal with the expected learning deficit that these pupils might have. So what we see there is actually a strong increase in the decrease due to the pandemic year. So where high parental education pupils still lose to the tune of about 3 percentile points, we see that these low parental education pupils lose about 5 percentile points, which is significantly larger, especially given the fact that they have already been performing at a lower average level before. We've studied this quite in depth, and I think we'll have some more discussion about this as well. But actually, the reason why we find this effect to be as large as it is has to do with two mechanisms. And the one which is most strong is that, normally speaking, these pupils tend to improve most. So in school, we see most people staying at the same level throughout the year. But actually, we find that low and lowest parental education pupils have small increases in improvements of performance due to the educational system, which is, I think, something strong positive of the system in a way. So it does what it's meant to do, which is close the gaps of pupils which have a deficit to begin with. Unfortunately, what we see during the pandemic shutdown is that this gap, this improvement, vanishes, in addition to a loss which is shared amongst all pupils. Oh, going up. Right, so let me get into the question, which is obviously the biggest problem with identification, is this attrition in a data set. So we do a couple of things to evaluate or to address this attrition, or possible non-random attrition going on. To start with, let me first show you how the same results look like when you compare two random years to one another. So we did some extensive tests to see whether this effect is actually a trend or something else going on. So what you can see is that in every other year, when you just use any other comparison year as a treatment, we find a lot of null effects. So there's not that much going on. But let's talk about attrition, right? Which is the big question mark for most studies, I think, in the field. What you see on the right-hand side is the number of missing to follow-up in 2019, which is a normal year, at the school level. So these are the number of schools which had 0 kids missing an end-of-year test whenever they did have a middle-of-year test. And as you can see, most schools have very little missingness. Some schools have some more, but it's a bit, it looks the same basically for all control years. So what we see in the pandemic years, that actually quite a lot of schools completely stopped testing, right? You have a very large amount of schools who chose not to test at all, which might lead to biases in our effects. So we have a couple of ways to address attrition. Obviously, the regression adjustment is one, but we also do a bit of a kitchen sink approach, where we only look at those schools who had similar rates of testing. And we did a bit more nuanced, or how do you say, sophisticated methods as well. So we do propensity score balancing, entropy balancing. We add school fixed effects, and we even add sibling fixed effects to control even more background noise. I think, so these show our robustness checks. And I think it's quite clear. There's very little movement in our treatment effects. This is our main effect, and this is the effect by parental education. And what we find is extremely little movement when we control for all kinds of possible sample selection into the treatment year. which leaves us even more confidence into our results in this case. I'll just add one more thing because I think I have to mind the time. So there's a big question, obviously, why is this effect so large, and what does this effect comprise of? And thinking about this, so the tests we use, CETO tests, they test both past curriculum content and they test new curricular content. So it might be, for example, that pupils didn't get the new information they were supposed to get, or it could be, for example, that they forgot previous content. A completely different explanation, which is equally salient potentially and has to be addressed, is the fact that there might be a lot of contextual effects going on. And there's research showing that, for example, pupils who have to do tests in different environments and they're used to perform less well. There's evidence that, for example, home environment or stress at home can affect testing. And so there's a big question whether, well, pupils return from homeschooling for 8 weeks, they re-enter the school, they have to do a test, that there is actually a contextual component to the loss that we observe, right? Maybe it's an adjustment effect, maybe it's stress in the household. And we've tried to tease out a bit these sort of competing mechanisms by using a fourth test, which is the DMT test. It's a bit of a weird test. Pupils are asked to read a large number of words in a short amount of time. The reason why we use it in this case is because it doesn't explicitly test any curricular content. So it's not meant to test new didactic knowledge. So it can be used in a way to sort of test this other hypothesis of contextual effects. This is the solid estimates, and these are our previous estimates. And what we see here indeed is that even for this test, which isn't supposed to actually measure any didactic content, we still see quite a loss. It's about a third of the full effect. So it leads us to believe that there's definitely something to be said for example, contextual effects having taken place in our study, but most of the effect that we see being due to didactic loss, which is the much larger effect that we see when we use tests which actually capture didactic content. I'm gonna just show you this, which is basically looking at the treatment effect by school, which is something which I think is very interesting follow-up, but we might not have the time to discuss it now, but we find quite large school differences in our estimated treatment effect. So some schools actually losing magnitudes of the size that other schools are losing. Some schools even improving, but mostly not statistically significantly. And I've actually tried to do some first work, but I think what Melanie is doing right now is actually a much more sophisticated way of doing that and answering why do we see these differences among schools. So we had a couple of sort of exploratory analysis there, where we, for example, relate school differences to, for example, school weight, which is a school indicator of socioeconomic status. And we also did this with immigrant background, for example. These are individual level characteristics we don't have at present in the data set. We can discuss this more in depth in a discussion if there's time and room for it. I'll skip through this because this has been mostly, well, maybe I'll discuss it very briefly. How representative is the Netherlands for other countries? Well, a couple things. Netherlands is, well, you could say in certain ways it's a best case scenario. We had a fairly short shutdown of schools. We have very good broadband coverage. We were arguably one of the most prepared countries. We've had good funding, helping children from families who had financial difficulties with, for example, getting computers, etc. So the effects that we find might be upper bound of what you could expect in other countries with less good resources. That having been said, making the calculation from percentile loss to actual percentage of learning, which usually is performed in a year, we can safely say that based on the evidence in the Netherlands and 8 weeks of shutdown, that almost all of those 8 weeks have been lost. So the pupils have actually lost a percentage of amount of teaching that they should normally get in a year, equal to the length of the shutdown in our case. So effects are sizable. and problematic also.